Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of the Nonprofit World. You know, a lot of wonderful things are being accomplished by nonprofit organizations in our area and around the country. And this is the show where you find out what they're up to and how you can have a role in them as well. For nonprofits to have a successful mission, people who lead nonprofit groups really have to be creative. Sometimes they have to apply techniques that are usually known in the for-profit world. But how do you blend the two? Today we'll find out because our guest is an expert in that. We're delighted to be joined by Scot Scala. Scot is the founder of Scala and Associates, and he spent decades working with groups, advising them on how to accomplish their goals in the short term and in the long run. And the mission of Scala and Associates is to foster excellence in the nonprofit sector through successful fund development. Welcome, Scot. A delight to have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure.
This is an interesting field, the world of nonprofits. How did you come to be associated with it?
Well, I started out in 1990 thinking I was going to be a school teacher. I was substitute teaching but couldn't quite land a full-time job and had gone to college, graduate school, to go into teaching. But I was offered an opportunity to go into administration, and it was through my work as an educational administrator that a change in my career really happened. And I continued for 17 years until I experienced job loss. And it was experiencing that job loss that came after what really I thought was a career that would continue for the rest of my working years, that I shifted. I found myself working for a nonprofit organization here in Connecticut, a wonderful mission, but lost my job after a year. And what I always share with people is that I lost my job at a time when I was new in the state. My wife is from Connecticut, but I'm from New York State originally, so I really had very few professional contacts. We had a 5-year-old, almost 6-year-old son at home and a 5-week-old baby, and we were closing on our new home the next day. So I said, all right, it's time to make a shift.
I think some people call that a perfect storm.
A perfect storm, my come to Jesus moment, whatever we want to call it. But it was a turning point in my life. And it was then that I really did make a shift in my career. And I started Scala and Associates and never looked back, and it's been going strong now 11 years.
Back then, I would imagine that nonprofits had sort of a hodgepodge way of getting their funds together, how to keep their missions alive and going. What was it like back then?
In the Stone Ages? Yeah. Well, keep in mind that around 1990 to 95, which is really those early years for me, we didn't have as many nonprofits as we have today. We have just over 1 million nonprofits in the United States, a few 100,000 back then. So there were fewer nonprofits competing for the same dollars, the same attention, the same space, if you will, in the community. Also, what was different then is how people went about funding their nonprofits. You know, we didn't have social media. We didn't really have internet up until 1995, 1996. So the option now that we have to raise revenue through social media and other things like Facebook and GoFundMe, and it just didn't exist. It was much harder. I had a sense back then that we were very much in the trenches. And remember, I was working in-house for nonprofits then, so I can see it now from both sides. Now as a consultant to nonprofits, but then working in-house. And you definitely had a sense that you were in the trenches fighting to fulfill that mission. Not that we don't have that today, but the processes that exist today are much different than years ago. It's much more streamlined and lends itself to building the capacity of the organization long-term and sustaining it. That's the key. Building it, but sustaining it.
So fast forward now to 2018. We do have the internet. We do have GoFundMe projects. But we also don't have things that used to be around. For example, the United Way, a wonderful group, doesn't reach into as many areas as it used to just because jobs are different now. There aren't as many large employers. That puts challenges on people like you and the organization that you run. what are some of the new thinking methods to bring people around to seeing their nonprofits in ways that look toward the future and can plan for the long term? I believe the term that's in use is called capacity building. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is continuing to be an emerging trend. It really took shape, I would say, since 2000, the early 2000s. Had started in the 1990s, but really took shape after that. That is one of the three things we do at Scala and Associates, so I know quite a bit about capacity building. The other two areas are everything under the umbrella of grants, and then, of course, the education and training that comes with working with boards of directors. But capacity building has been the one area that has shown the most growth over, let's say, the past decade or so. And the reason for that is, first of all, it's embraced by community foundations in particular. Other foundations do support it. But community foundations have funds allocated to support nonprofits through grants to then go out and hire consultants, neutral parties to come in and implement capacity building, which is a very systematic approach to, first of all, assessing the nonprofit's ability to build its own capacity, largely through its current structure, including staffing, board development, and various fund development practices. It assesses that. Second, it plans for it to be successful within all of those components, and then ultimately, and something I care very much about, is help with implementation of the plan. I have gone into too many nonprofits where the former process ended at the plan and didn't continue on with the implementation. So I personally will not take on a capacity building project if it doesn't include the implementation piece, because I certainly don't want my plan sitting on a shelf and it's not successful for the organization. And for me as the consultant, I will have not done my job properly if the implementation is not something that I assist with.
It sounds like the first step, the assessment, is sort of the look in the mirror phase. What's that like when someone like you walks in the door to an organization that's been around, maybe struggling a little bit, and they're forced to look in the mirror?
Yeah. Well, I come in, any consultant comes in to the nonprofit sector wanting to bring about change. And as human beings, we don't deal well with change. It's not within our genetic makeup, I don't think, for most of us. But the mindset really has to be that the consultant comes in to implement some change. With that comes an assessment. I have a multi-point assessment checklist that I will sit down at the offices of the nonprofit organization and really go through their current fund development practices. I will look at their infrastructure, their staffing model. Do they have a development staff? In other words, the fundraisers, the grant writer, the development officer, et cetera. Or is the executive director the one doing the development work? Or is it a volunteer? Or somebody on the board? Sometimes we see that. And what is the board composition? What does that look like? How often do they meet? What is their role in moving the mission of the organization beyond governance? You asked me about what was different then versus now. Well, back then, all we heard was the board should govern, the board should govern, the board should govern. These days, the mantra is, and not just my own, but certainly the theme in the sector is, they also must be owners of the fund development process. In other words, the financial support that comes in, and also controlling the expenses that go out, because if there's no control over the fund development practices, there will be nothing to govern. You see, the two go hand in hand.
It almost sounds like sweat equity.
Sweat equity. Yeah, we can't just be on boards to build resumes or to have something to do. I'm simplifying it, but sometimes I meet boards that really don't take seriously the role that they have. So we look at all of that, we assess it. We also will do confidential surveys. These are very telling of the board and key staff members, key meaning the leadership staff, let's say, and even program managers and so forth. Confidential in that only I will know the outcome of those assessments. And so I then put those results, again, without identifying any people, to the comments in a report and a presentation back to the organization very telling. I have been in those meetings where you see the eyes just widen. I didn't know people thought that way, or I didn't know that was an issue, or that's a missed opportunity, you know? Mm-hmm. And those are some of the outcomes that I, as a consultant, look for. I want to see where those opportunities are and where people maybe have missed the boat. And frankly, what is working? You know, it's not always gloom and doom. So often we discover many things that are working very well. So from that assessment, we then go to the next step, which is the planning phase. And the planning phase is multifaceted. I like to attach the plan to the organization's fiscal year. Sure. And then we look at every component. Let's say if we're talking about fund development, we're looking at your annual appeals, if you have annual appeals, the way you communicate with and approach individual donors, the way you steward major gift opportunities and those donors. Those opportunities are very different from your annual appeal and your $25 and $50 donors, who are very important, mm-hmm. but you approach major giving very differently. Plan giving, is that an option where we're looking at bequests, and if so, how do we communicate that? It's a very communication, marketing driven initiative, plan giving. Is an endowment a possibility? You know, colleges, universities, hospitals do endowments very well. The general nonprofit sector, not always. Because they don't know enough about it, and we tend not to do what we don't understand, and that certainly is true. So we look at all of those things and the staffing and the board composition that it will take to move all of that along, and then the implementation comes in, and that's where I continue at helping them take those baby steps to move forward.
Of those three, is there one that's more particularly challenging?
The implementation is really where you see who's got it and who doesn't, because it's easy to sit in a meeting mm-hmm. and say, this is how I feel during the audit phase or during the unveiling of the results and even the planning phase, to say, great, looks good, terrific. But when it comes to the implementation, that's when you see who really is on board. And I have been with a few organizations where they lose a board member. And sometimes the executive director is appalled, or the board chair, if it's not the board chair who is left, will be appalled. And I say, don't be appalled. It's okay. This person now has been freed. They can go and do other things. This wasn't right for them. If you want to sustain the mission of your organization, this is part of the change. Often that's not the case, though, Jerry. Mm-hmm. People do stay on, and most adopt that new way of doing business.
Because they've made an investment in your advice and know they have an issue that needs to be solved or two.
Right. They've made an investment in time, in money, in energy, in changing the dynamics of the way they do business. And by the time of implementation, they have become so vested in the process that it would be foolish not to continue. I also try to make it very easy, frankly, for the board of directors. We can't ask the board of directors to do the staff's job. I think if there are gaps in staffing, we need to look at how to fill those gaps in staffing. The board members are typically very busy people, and I serve on one or two boards, one national, one local. So I, again, can see it from both sides. Mm-hmm. Ask board members to do very specific, high-level things that will yield good results, quality results. For example, help us leverage some relationships in the community where they don't currently exist. That's something that most people will wrap their minds around. I would rather see board members help us connect the dots in the community than worry about fundraising. That's when you see them just melt down, because they're typically not fundraisers. And I mm-hmm. typically don't ask boards to fundraise, but help us connect the dots to those relationships and let I say us, meaning the nonprofit organization under my counsel, help to cultivate that donor. But that's the relationship piece is so instrumental in getting to that next step.
I know that one of the things you bring to your practice is, when you get to the implementation phase, is patience. That patience is required to fulfill the big plan. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, patience is something also I think as human beings we don't tend to manage well, but patience is absolutely required when working in the nonprofit sector, especially in the area of fund development. And the reason for that is it's a process. And any process worthwhile, and this certainly is in building the capacity of the nonprofit, must be approached with a sense of patience. When you're impatient with the process, that's when mistakes happen. Missed opportunities are there. Years ago, before I started with Scala & Associates, I worked for a healthcare organization, and I remember one visit in particular, a wealthy person in the community that had a relationship with the healthcare organization. And when I came back, the CEO, who was my supervisor, said, "Well, how much did she donate?" And I said, "This was my first visit. We're getting to know each other. We're building trust. We're building a sense of a rapport, a sense of what comes next." I said, "This is not how it works." It was a hard sell there when you don't come back with a check. But, and I really think it was months down the road that the philanthropy began. And months sometimes is a great track record. Often it's years. But those major gifts, I'm talking about major giving in this case, it's such a personal thing. When somebody's giving a significant amount of their money, they must truly be treated well, communicated with properly, as you and I would probably want in a business relationship, especially one that was hitting our wallet. You want to make sure that trust is there, and you can't build it with a sense of impatience.
Can we divert for a while? What sorts of groups have you worked with in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I only work with nonprofit organizations. I have been approached by for-profit companies or even individuals like professors at colleges and so forth, but only with nonprofit organizations. Anything and everything. We've worked with hospitals, we've worked with universities and colleges, smaller nonprofits, nonprofits with budgets that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and those with budgets of, let's say, $300,000. But what's interesting is that the need is all the same. It's just a different scale. They all need, if we do things properly, and that's how I roll. The grants have to be there. The volunteerism hopefully is there. The board working at a proper level has to be there. Whether it's a board of 10 or a board of 20, it has to be there. The diversity in fund development. If you're all government funding, and it sounds like a great story to tell, it's not. We now know, especially in our state of Connecticut, that if you are relying on government funding wholly, that much, it can be a little troublesome. And that is true in most states, not just certainly here. Those nonprofit organizations that take the time to build the capacity through, let's say, diversified fund development, all of those various fund development aspects that we just discussed, are the ones that are more likely to sustain themselves long term, because as one shrinks, the others pick up. As one grows, the others change. It's the cycle of things. It's like not keeping all your money in one stock. Diversify your portfolio, you're more likely to retain those funds 10, 20 years down the road.
Are you able to share a few success stories that you've had along the way? People who've gone, "Oh, wow, this really worked. I'm glad I listened to you."
Well, one of the things I have found with many organizations is that they have stories to tell. For example, any social service or human service organization has a story to tell, but many just become consumed by the statistics and they drown in data. Data is important. It helps to support and substantiate that need. How we know the need is there, well, here's the data. But the stories get to show the community, the potential funder, your partners out there, the impact you're making, how you're changing lives, whether it be children, the homeless, people receiving meals from soup kitchens, those in shelter, animals being cared for. The stories tell it all. And I have never worked with a nonprofit organization where I couldn't uncover some story to tell. And then telling that story, as I did, let's say last year for an annual appeal, a first annual appeal for a nonprofit, it brought in 6 times what other efforts had done previously through letter campaigns and things that they did. But this was a more formalized appeal process, and they were delighted with the results. And all they did was tell the story. I interviewed the individual with permission, and they had a story to tell. They sure did.
Yes, 6-fold is quite an increase. Difficult to sustain maybe, but I'm sure it made an impact on their future to be able to have that nest egg.
Yeah, and by no means will that 6-fold increase continue. I mean, when you go from very little to 6-fold, that's a great jump. But moving forward, it will just grow more modestly. But the point is, it will grow and it will continue. But 6-fold from a few $1,000s can really be substantial for a small nonprofit organization, regardless of how many times over it increased. The point is, it did increase, and the story is the reason why. So that's just one example of something that I think nonprofits can look to do as they're looking to build their capacity and fund development and tell those stories.
You also work with faith-based groups. Are there any characteristics that make them different from organizations that are not?
Well, I think what faith-based groups have to be careful about in, let's say, when it comes to fund development and the funds that are needed to build the capacity and sustain the mission long term, is that if their work in any way is restricted to people of a certain faith, if they only will provide services to Catholics or Jewish people, or et cetera, it's fine if that's your mission and you're true to your mission, fine. But do understand that there are people who, and funders, most funders, even those that give to faith-based groups, who will see that as a negative, discriminatory in a way. So just be cautious when you're a faith-based group as to whether or not you are in any way restrictive to the population. If it's true to your mission to be so, fine, but you'll have to live with some consequences and other advantages. But if you can broaden your scope and really appeal to those with the umbrella of faith to the service that you're providing, you will open up, you're more likely to open up other channels of support.
That makes perfect sense. Volunteers, in many cases, are the backbone of a successful mission. What sort of things do you bring in your planning and implementation that activates volunteers, that gets them involved, and hopefully even brings in new volunteers?
Well, volunteerism is one of the areas on the capacity building audit or assessment. So we do look at the volunteer base, and we do that because even in areas where, let's say, the staffing is slim, is there an opportunity for a volunteer to step into that role? It doesn't have to be permanent. Volunteers do come and go, but it could be an opportunity to get a skilled volunteer who, let's say, lives and breathes social media, as many young people do, to come in and assist with that. Something that's often not done well or at all in nonprofits is a social media impact. But maybe there's a young volunteer who can assist there. We look for those opportunities in the assessment, and then it becomes part of the planning process. And then we discuss, who do we know currently who might have an interest in volunteering, and then how do we seek out that type of support. Also, a wonderful thing for boards to do is to reach into their network to garner some volunteer support. Boards will love any opportunity not to necessarily go through a Rolodex to ask for money, which I get, because I don't necessarily like it either when I'm asked to do that. Happier to build relationships. But when you ask, is there anybody you know who might have an interest enough to help through volunteerism, then you see the mind starting to work. So boards are tapped into the community. Your staff members, of course, tapped into the community. And community foundations are great resources for people, too, to go back to their local community foundation, say, we're in need of volunteers, or even board members. Community foundations have a finger on the pulse of things by design. So go to your community foundation and do ask for assistance, whether it be through additional volunteerism from people in the community that they may have identified, board service. things of that nature, people to serve on a subcommittee to help with volunteerism. Volunteerism is the backbone when it comes to supporting nonprofits with time and resources, often in areas that nonprofits can't afford to sustain on their own.
That's all looking at it from the organization's point of view. Let's turn this around and talk about individuals, people at home watching this, people on their mobile devices now watching this, of course. They're now inspired to become volunteers. What sort of tips do you give to people who are thinking of, you know, maybe it's time for me to get involved with things, to have my family involved?
Sure. I actually do have 3 tips that I give to people who are thinking of working with a nonprofit organization in some way. Another way to not just build your own capacity, but help the nonprofit do that as well for themselves and move that mission. So the first is, if you have a child in your life, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a godparent, an aunt, an uncle, if you can engage that child in philanthropy, volunteerism, charitable work at an early age, what a wonderful gift. We have 2 sons who are now 19 and 13. When they were each about 7, 8 years old, we started them off with, whether it be giving at church or out of their own piggy bank, or with my older son especially working at the soup kitchen in Bristol with me, which was a combined parish effort, assisting maybe with some work that my wife and I do on a voluntary basis with our church's Haiti ministry. Starting the child in your life or children in your life at an early age, get them engaged. You will have somebody with a philanthropic mindset maybe for the rest of their life. So that's very important. The second is, try to choose a nonprofit organization where the mission is closely aligned with what's in your heart. When you do that, you are more likely to stay on and be engaged with that nonprofit organization long term. It's a win-win for you and for the nonprofit organization.
An example might be?
If you have had yourself or family with maybe cancer in your history, your family, consider volunteering for the American Cancer Society or some other cancer or disease-related organization. Heart problems, I have that in my family. I've worked in the past with the American Heart Association. You see, if you find that connection that really is moving to you, you're more likely to stay with that nonprofit long-term. It's important, rather than it be just a temporary thing. And lastly, understand, please, as volunteers, the need is not just around the holidays, it's all year round. So I think when people understand the need is now, the need is in spring, summer, fall, it's all year round. Volunteers are often welcomed at any point, as are our dollars, not just around the holidays, but all year round, because nonprofits have to function continuously, uninterrupted. Their programs must be sustained uninterrupted to really have that true impact.
In closing, this is a challenging time to be involved with a nonprofit. Our worser angels are on our shoulders as a society these days. But on the other hand, what is these days, this year, the most rewarding thing about being involved in a nonprofit?
For me personally, or are you asking me in terms of?
For you and for others, for both.
For me personally, I have been in this industry now 28 years in total. I will do this until, my last breath. I love my work. I love my work. And to be engrossed in many different nonprofits that seem to now more than ever really take the time to be sponges and listen to education and direction and guidance and counsel, and then assistance with the implementation. That's so rewarding to me when you can see those changes you're making, and then ultimately the change it's having on the people that they serve. So for me personally, that's it. I think in general, my message to people who are thinking about becoming involved in nonprofits is to know that your time with those nonprofits really does matter. And you can have a lasting impact on the lives of people or animals or whatever the mission is serving if you just give your time and attention to that work. It's been rewarding for me for 28 years, and I hope for another 28 at least.
A valuable message. Thank you very much, Scott.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, pleasure to have you here today. We've been speaking with Scot Scala. He is the head and founder of Scala Associates, a consulting group that works with nonprofits of all ilks.